Do their own introductions. I will only say that we will be turning it over, and this is a panel on framing the challenges. How can connection technology support sustainable development? We're starting to go now into specific sectors, and we have a tremendous panel of experts led by Nancy Keith Kelly, Director of Stakeholder Engagement and Environmental Sustainability of Hewlett-Packard. Nancy?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for being patient as we're getting everyone together. I'd like to introduce the panel, a little bit different of a setup from what you previously saw. Each panelist will have about 10 minutes to go through their discussion points on how connection technologies can support sustainable development. Then we'll look for a small Q&A from folks. So again, as a process, raise your hand, get a microphone, and we'll keep the discussion going. So first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Ann Bartuska from the Department of Agriculture, where she is a Deputy Undersecretary of Research, Education, and Economics, followed by Eric Dishman from Intel, who is the Director of Health and Policy Innovation, followed by Charmel Terborg, who is substituting for Jack Dangermond, who sadly came down with the flu, Head of Government Affairs from ESRI, and last but not least, Paul Kudrowski, who's a Senior Fellow from the Kauffman Foundation. And throughout the next hour with you, we're really going to be talking about what are the roadblocks to bringing connection technologies to sustainable development, who are the major affected populations, and what are the key ways to address that specific challenge. What existing technologies are we seeing today that are advancing solutions to some of these challenges? And what I think could also be a more interesting part of the conversation, especially following the last panel on innovation, is what are the new technologies that could be out there that are being discussed and potentially brought to market? So starting off, we will be hearing from Ann from the Department of Agriculture.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to go and click on my slides. And it's not mine up. Click down to go down. Okay, great. Okay, well, still good morning, and really appreciate being given this opportunity to talk about my world. And actually, the title of my organization, Research, Education, and Economics, actually does capture the full scope of what I really want to talk about, and that's connecting science and economics through processes and systems into education and information, and how do we actually create that system in a more organized way. And I guess since we're supposed to ignite you a little bit to get into the breakout sessions, the one thing I wanted to start off with is we've already talked about the 3 pillars of sustainability. We've talked about environment, economics, and social systems being very important. I guess what I'd like you to think about is a new algorithm, one that integrates food, water, and energy to equal human health and well-being, because all of those pieces are what we have to address in a very integrated and systematic way to deliver on all of those needs that we have as humans, but also recognizing that we also want the well-being that comes from a stable society and a stable environment. And so putting those explicitly together is what my world is about. But some of the challenges that we've got to face in accomplishing this, really puts a very fine point on the heavy lift that we have to address this issue in sustainable agriculture and connecting food, water, and energy. One is we are well on the path for 9 billion people by 2050. So we have this challenge of feeding in a sustainable manner the growth of the human population that we will have to contend with. At the same time, we have a global land that is about 25% degraded that we also have to address, because some of those lands could be productive, and I'll come back to that, but that's where some of our science has really created a system out there to be able to improve the quality of the land that we have. We also increasingly have this connection between humans and animals, and the fact that disease transmission through zoonotic diseases is a very high level and a level that we have to also incorporate into our thinking. That's the human health and well-being aspect. And then perhaps the most crucial, in addition to food, is water. We can't separate those two. And we are increasingly struggling with the effect of water delivery. Why they're so connected to agriculture, 70% of water is used for irrigation. And so being able to reduce that amount, being able to manage our agricultural systems in a more efficient way are absolutely critical. So those are the challenges, and just those are some of the challenges, and that's the facts. But where do we go in the future, and what are the opportunities, and especially in this context of connecting technologies? Well, one of the things that we have demonstrated over time is, in fact, science does produce innovations in these systems that has improved our quality of life. We have actually increased over the last 30 years our ability to produce food by 50% on less land and with less labor. And so we have actually been able to demonstrate that what we have learned in the past by agricultural practices that degrade land, in fact, have been turned around, and that we can have a different approach to those systems. Our challenge now is taking advantage of those systems. How do we continue to improve our practices to reduce the water that is consumed? Taking technology so that you have a much better approach to where water is delivered, how it's delivered, and the timing of that delivery. And then the other is, how do we take advantage of some of these systems to address energy needs? There was just a report out last week that indicated that for 8 countries, that we could actually generate 17.6 of advanced biofuels from agricultural residues alone. Now, residues are exactly that. That's the stuff we leave after we've removed the good stuff. It's the stuff we leave after we've taken the food part of those agricultural systems. So if we can actually better integrate that energy piece with the agricultural systems, you can have a much more self-sustaining system to be working within. So what's the connection to technologies here? How do we improve, or what is the opportunity? Well, one of the great experiments in the United States that began 150 years ago was connecting the science institutions, and in this case it was the land-grant institutions of the United States. The land-grant universities were established 150 years ago and partnered with the Department of Agriculture. So we had a system where we would connect new science through a system called Extension, which was developing the science, taking the science and turning it into languages, into products that actually could be used to better inform the practitioner. So institutionalizing that system 150 years ago and moving that into the 21st century, maybe 22nd century, with new technologies and new systems is, I think, a real opportunity for us, and that is the system in which it exists. One of the values of that system is that it encourages peer-to-peer learning. There is a very powerful, we've talked already about that in terms of crowdsourcing information and that whole social nexus out there. But the ability of a farmer in one place who has specialized in dryland farming, and let's say in the southwestern United States, to connect with a dryland farmer in Africa and to exchange those practices, what has been learned from that, is a very powerful place to be. It helps us to better understand that linkage between the system, the water use, and how you can be more efficient on that. But the other opportunities is to exchange new materials. We have, in some countries, and certainly here in the United States, we've talked about heirloom tomatoes. And I was at a site yesterday in southern San Jose that actually has a drought-tolerant rose variety that is unique to the area, that has sort of been lost over the generations, and they're trying to bring it back. We have that genetic material out there in the larger world that we should be exchanging. This peer-to-peer connection would allow someone, and there's a recent rediscovery of a wheat variety in the Russian steppes that grows in cold, dry landscapes. We need to have access to that germplasm in a way that could build and produce more agricultural products in the future. So how do we connect those folks? How do you connect that germplasm and take advantage of those systems is where I think some of these connecting technologies can really, really help. And in fact, I learned yesterday about a project going on in Uganda where cell phones are being used to get crop price information to farmers very quickly. We need that same kind of technology to get real weather data to farmers so they don't put the seeds in too early, that they don't try to harvest too quickly, that they fertilize appropriately. And being able to have that knowledge out there is exactly the kind of sweet spot in sustainable agriculture that we need to go. So that aspect of getting the science into practice, that aspect of connecting technology to users, I think is a very, very powerful one and has some very real-world applications. So one big concern, and I didn't put it on here as a major challenge, but there's also, unfortunately, a disinvestment in the very research that helped us get that 50% increase in productivity. There has been a disinvestment in agricultural research globally, with one exception, and China continues to show increases, and in fact just announced this, I think it was this week, increased investment. We have to turn that around because that disinvestment in science that contributes to agricultural production, forestry, natural resource use, many of the other areas that contribute to that linkage between food and water and energy is something that we can't afford. We know that we connect new science to innovation to new products. So turning around that disinvestment, being able to continue to show how the science that is done, that it's focused very clearly on these particular issues that we have identified as productivity challenges, and being able to, and I think really can change the future. There are opportunities in the sweet spot, as I talked about, to really improve the productivity, to be very deliberate about it, but also to put it into the sustainability context. So, thank you.
And thank you, Anne. We have a couple minutes for questions from the audience. Not a one. Up, gentleman in the back. Let's see. Maybe if you keep your hand raised, someone can get to you with a microphone. Let's see.
In the meantime, there's a question
Sorry,
right here.
forgive me.
Okay.
In the meantime, there's a question off of Twitter. And Tony Barnowski's asking, how can we integrate biodiversity maintenance into the food, water, energy equals human well-being equation?
That's a great question. It's actually something that we have been increasingly looking at. And just one example, if we have an opportunity to, let's say a farmer has a field that we want to take some of that land out of food production in order to achieve some biodiversity goals. And one area is in creating riparian forest buffers or other buffer strips. If there is a value associated with that conversion for biodiversity purposes, for water purposes, being able to provide an incentive and provide the value of that so that that farmer actually gets a monetary benefit out of it. It becomes part of their bottom line. Those are the kinds of opportunities that we have out there. And we've had a lot of discussions about ecosystem services and creating environmental markets for that. It's a very nascent area. It's not a well-developed marketplace, but there's pockets of innovation. And I think that's really sending us in the direction that we can have both of those aspects. But we also have to understand what the system looks like out there, and that's where some of the geospatial technology comes in.
Gentleman in the back.
Yeah, I'm Cliff Block. For many years, I headed USAID's programs in the use of communications in education, health, and to some extent agriculture. Now working domestically in Berkeley and as a consultant. My question, Anna, is with regard to creating that kind of effective extension program in developing countries that you aptly described as critical, has been critical to increasing productivity. I've worked in developing countries where there are as few as one extension agent for 1,000, 2,000, or 10,000 people with Jeeps that have no gasoline. So they can't go out. There is an old technology, radio, that does reach people, and at one point, especially in Latin America, there were a number of very effective programs utilizing local radio to reflect those sub-regional differences that you indicated are really crucial in terms. dry land, et cetera, and also giving voice to local farmers. Can you say anything about what the current status of those kinds of efforts are, and perhaps combinations of radio with cell phone technologies, et cetera?
I actually have not heard any discussion about local radio, but I have heard a lot of discussion about using cell phone technology to get more rapid dissemination of information, but also to upgrading the extension approach, or maybe it's more appropriately exporting culturally appropriate extension to other countries. I've actually been very heartened on how much within the global food security area, with USAID's leadership working with ourselves in being able to take the extension model. And actually we have some people here from extension, especially the e-extension, which is the internet web-based approach to extension, moving that into other countries and being able to develop a similar analogous system so that you can get information. But I think this is what's so, this peer-to-peer learning, where you have a network of trained people who bring the discipline of the science and the knowledge, but the distribution of the information rapidly is through people in the local communities, people who are knowledgeable about local systems, and being able to be very clever about that, as I think what we're struggling with, but I think there's also some hope and opportunity out there.
Gentleman over here, sorry. Would you raise your hand again so she can, thank you.
Rabia Muhtar, Qatar Foundation. How do we reduce the water use? That 72% that you mentioned, where do we start? Because technology apparently is not enough. We have a lot of technology that we have developed, but that has not made it to those who need it. So how do we reduce that?
Well, some of it is actually, there is technology, and the more interesting ones are GPS related irrigation systems that allow you to turn off and turn on in a very precise way. Not suitable for everywhere, certainly not available for every country, but that is one start. But that's why I wanted to mention the wheat variety from the Russian steppes, where we need to be able to explore and then utilize and expand the use of germplasm that needs less water. So this whole idea of water use efficiency, it's partly biological, it's partly technological, and marrying the two, I think, are very important. In fact, if there was a growth area, I think, in global integration of agriculture, it's a dryland farming. Really being able to take advantage of the knowledge that some countries already have. I mean, our desert Southwest, there's a lot of land out there, and some of it was agricultural land, but we don't really have a good capacity to use it, and we need to get people's expertise from where it has been globally more successful. So I think as I said, it's biology, it's technology, but it's also sharing experiences on what's working.
Great, last question right here, and then we'll have to move on.
Thank you. My name is Staffan Tillander. I'm with the Swedish Foreign Ministry and working in New York presently. You mentioned that there is a disinvestment in research, and this must be turned around. It would be interesting to hear you elaborate that. Is that mainly a U.S. Disinvestment in the U.S. context, or is it a global phenomenon? You mentioned China was increasing. And if this is a global problem, what do you think that Rio, if you think Rio could do something about this? Because one of the things that's on the table for Rio is, of course, the possibility for research and development of technology in these areas.
I think there is a, and I have a graphic, but I'm not going to pull it up because it probably would generate more questions. But we have the data from around the world. And I think in general, agricultural natural resources, the practical sciences, have been supplanted by investments in biomedical research and energy and in other high growth areas, and probably appropriately in the larger scheme of things. But that very disinvestment, and I don't know if it's because we, as a culture or as a community, we decided we learned enough, or in the balance of things, these are glitzier areas to go into energy uses and bioenergy versus agriculture. But I think what we need to turn around is recognizing production of food is probably more important than anything else, because if people do not have food security, and I'd say water security along with that, all these other things become moot. And so part of the change is recognizing that agriculture is just a fundamental need that we have for a right we have, which is to eat. And I think being able to turn and make that as part of the sustainable development, a fundamental pillar is food and delivery of food. And that's why I said my algorithm change is from environment and economics and social systems to food, water, and energy as being the pillars in which we look at sustainability. We could really then change the way we integrate those different pieces.
Thank you, Anne. I think we'll transition now and hear from Eric Dishman at Intel.
Do you need some water?
So, good morning. Come on, I need more energy than that. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. Don't make me do the wave. We'll come and do the wave, and then you'll be in trouble. It's an honor for me to be here from both Intel Corporation and our joint venture with GE called CARE Innovations. It's really particularly great to be celebrating the 20-year anniversary of Rio and to think about what is innovation and what do we need to do to drive sustainability for the next 20 years. And as I was preparing for this, I kind of realized that my own start in Silicon Valley started the same summer of the Rio conference 20 years ago. I worked for Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft. I showed up as a graduate student, and they asked me to sort of go study places that didn't have technology. And that was the very first time I ever studied a nursing home. And we actually built our first prototype 20 years ago of a remote patient monitoring technology that allowed us to do vital signs capture of a grandmother's blood pressure and heart rate so that she didn't have to go travel to a clinic. And in many ways, that's the sort of topic that I want to talk to you about today, because that was vision 20 years ago, and it's fast becoming reality and need today. So if you take only one message away from me today, what I would say to you is, if we are to build sustainable and maintain sustainable development globally, then we're going to have to develop a sustainable healthcare system. And if we're going to develop a sustainable healthcare system, then we have to take healthcare home. That's my one message. And I'm going to spend the rest of the 10 minutes here talking to you about how we go about and ask you to brainstorm in your breakout sessions, how do we begin to take healthcare home, and what's the role of these connection technologies to help us do that? Now, if you think about, as you're sitting here, the oldest person who you've ever known in your life, just sort of imagine them in your head and sort of think about how they talked, how they walked, what did they look like, their hair or their lack thereof, right? And now sort of look around this auditorium and imagine a fifth of the people in this auditorium being in that same age and having that same look and those same needs. That's a harbinger of the world that's about to come. Right? Back in 1950, there were 3,000 people on the planet who were over the age of 100. By 2050, demographers tell us there will be 6 million people over the age of 100. We have a success catastrophe. We have a longevity challenge, right? In the immortal words of Spock from Star Trek, those of you who are Star Trek fans, right? We need to live long and prosper. We've done a miraculous job at live long, but we're not doing a great job at prosper. And as Administrator Jackson this morning talked about the sort of global urbanization as one of the megatrends that we need to look about, what I would say to you is, on top of that global urbanization is the global elderization of our society. 2 billion of those 7 billion people are going to be over the age of 60. We already can't pay for healthcare in most parts of the world today. How are we going to double and then double again the needs of people 60 and above on the planet? Whether you're a younger society who's going to be delivering technologies and services into that market opportunity, or whether you're that older society who's trying to figure out how to cope with rising healthcare costs. So about 10 years ago at Intel, we started to go study global aging. And I'm a social scientist by training. We have a group of social scientists. We started out, and we've now done, over the last 10 years, we've gone and studied 1,000 elderly households in 20 different countries and in about 250 different healthcare facilities. Because we wanted to try to go understand what are the needs for technology in a wide array of places as we go try to tackle global aging. And that work has helped to fuel new product concepts around telehealth and home health that our company Care Innovations is doing. That work has helped to fund policy work that we do in the European Union and in the United States Health Reform Bill. And that work has helped to feed some of the age-friendly city work that we're doing in China right now as we contemplate building out whole new cities and making them age-friendly and ready for a global aging society. And when I did that field work, and I started doing it about 10 years ago, one of my sort of sub-studies I did was I went out to rural villages in parts of Europe. And in one of these particular villages, I remember it so well, the sort of town leader was sort of showing me around the town, and he drove me about 3 or 4 miles outside of town. And he takes me to this big empty lot. And he was sort of the unofficial mayor of this town. And he showed me this lot that he and all of these other people were trying to sort of raise money to build a hospital in. And he was, and he sort of said to me, I remember it so clearly, he's like, we have to build a hospital because it will signal that our community has arrived, that we have progressed. Now, the sad part of this story is about a year ago, I went and checked in to see the progress of how this town was doing at going out and building that hospital. It is still an empty lot. The man who was the unofficial mayor had died of emphysema. Most of the people who had invested money to go try to build that big shining hospital on a hill had lost most of their retirement savings and their nest egg, putting it into this effort that got caught up in the European debt crisis as 401ks and stock market plans and so forth crashed and burned. And what I would like to say to you today is the most tragic part of me to that is, in that 10 years, and it was really 20 years where they had been trying to raise money to build this hospital, they could have been using some really cheap available technologies to deliver high quality of care right there in their community if they had stopped setting the hospital as the goal for the ultimate in technological progress for healthcare. So as we think about global aging, and as we think about how we might build a sustainable healthcare system, what I want to say to you is we have to get out of the notion that a hospital is the endpoint, is the sign of success. And in fact, true innovation and true progress would be we design a healthcare system that only uses hospitals in the most rarest of cases and actually builds care capacity to the home and the community of people. And I would argue that emerging economies can jump right to that model because you don't need to build a network of big, shiny, expensive hospitals that are difficult to maintain. And the developed world is going to have to figure out how to retrofit its care model, its business model, to not be so hospital-centric. So how would we begin to do this? And what I want to do is propose to you kind of a framework that you can try to use in the breakout sessions today. At Intel, they love to make fun of me because every project I have has to have alliteration. So yes, this one's going to have alliteration. This is the 3 C's framework for trying to think about how we move from a hospital-centric society to a home care-oriented centric society. First, they're connectivity, care force, and community. So on connectivity, we go into country after country, and with a few exceptions, being Australia and a few others, most countries are wonderfully building out fiber networks or wireless networks of some flavor, and that's great. But they're letting entertainment, they're letting movies and the pipe to go send movies to people's desks drive the requirements. They're not thinking about how is that broadband pipe a fundamental capability to deliver healthcare to the home and to the community. And what new requirements might emerge as you develop that infrastructure that support home health, not just movies and music coming to the home. And it's a very different mentality, and it makes you ask a very different set of questions. Now, we've been doing work at Intel recently in La Paz, Mexico, helping them to build out a rural telehealth network. Very classic sort of situation that many of you in here are working on, I'm sure, where you're using basic telehealth infrastructure to connect physicians and nurses who are in an urban center with a rural place that has no access to that. And that is tremendous as a start. But what I would say to you is we still have a fundamental premise that that telehealth encounter is the exception, not the norm. We need to invert that and figure out how to design IT systems and a healthcare system that says a virtual visit is the norm, and we're only going to do face-to-face visits in big, expensive settings when they're absolutely medically necessary. So even with the progress that we're doing, we got to think about how that connectivity network, that broadband infrastructure, is ready to support home health and has the kind of speed and security and packet prioritization that makes sure that your emergency health data gets there before the recipes that you're sending to your friend on the internet, right? Some data is going to matter more than others, and it's not all about content protection for Hollywood movies, though that's certainly an important piece of it. Second C, what I call care force. This is we have to figure out, there's not going to be a scenario where we're going to suddenly create enough doctors and nurses worldwide to catch up with the need, right? They're a precious commodity that we have to be very scarce about using. So we have to create a care force, and we have to use connection technologies to skill shift a lot of care that doctors and nurses would do to family members, to volunteers, to community health workers, to patients themselves. We have to get out of the mentality that we wait until sick and then travel to the hospital to have experts at great expense put you back together again. That's simply an unsustainable model of healthcare around the world. So as we think about care force, and as you sort of break out and think about this second C today, I want to give you sort of two examples that we're working on at Intel. One is we've been using mobile phones with midwives in India for years for different projects to sort of say, look, it's unlikely you're going to be able to get the vast majority to have prenatal care to come into an urban area. How can we use these increasingly inexpensive wireless technologies to train community health workers who often have no training whatsoever, using the cell phone itself as both the platform to do the assessment, to do the training, to check in, and to reach out to an expert somewhere else if they actually need help. And the second is we recently announced something called the School Platform, the School Healthcare Education Platform in Sri Lanka. We started it in Sri Lanka, but it's going to expand. And our goal is to train 1 million health workers by 2015, and also actually put basic electronic health records for children in 5,000 schools. But the basic goal of this program is to say, look, we've got to start training a tech-savvy care force that's going to complement and augment the doctors and nurses and the medical specialists who are there. And we're probably going to need to invent new kinds of care force workers and volunteers that we haven't even conceived of yet if we're to solve our healthcare challenges going forward. Third and final C is community. So we have connectivity, care force, and community. Here I mean place-shifting care away from those expensive settings, increasingly into the home and into the community. Right? Diagnosis, treatment in the home, in the community, in the workplace, on the go, not necessarily in the big medical mainframe that we know of as the hospital. Now, at Intel, we've been doing a lot of work in this space in particular. Certainly, our Care Innovations Guide, which is the name of our telehealth technology, is fundamentally about enabling chronic care patients to do vital signs capture from home, a video visit with their clinician, just-in-time coaching and reminding with content that comes to them right when they're actually having a health problem, instead of using clinics and hospitals for the vast majority of the epidemics of chronic care that we're doing. It can and should be done. We've also been actually studying what are called hospital-at-home models in parts of Europe, and also been looking in the United States at the Veterans Administration, their home-based primary care for their sickest of the sick and the frailest of the frail for seniors. And we believe, and one of the challenges to think about as you sort of get together for preparing for Rio 2.0 is, we believe that 50% of care that's done in hospitals and in clinics today using connective technologies could be moved to the home and the community by 2020. And if it's not 50%, let's just aim for something even slightly less audacious, but that will start to get us thinking about putting our investment and our energy in a home-based system and not continuing to sort of build hospital after hospital that takes all of our human resources to maintain once you've actually built it. So in closing, these 3 C's are just ideas. They're a blueprint for you to start to think about this shift in thinking from this hospital-centric model to something that's going to retrofit our healthcare system, prepare for the future. I am not anti-hospital. We're going to build them, but we should build fewer of them. I'm not anti-clinic. We are going to build them, but we should build fewer of them. And at the starting place in our imagination is to say, we're going to build the capacity to deliver care in the home and the community. How do we do that? What's the workforce that we need? What are the technologies that we need? And what retraining do we need to accomplish that? And what's the business model that will govern it? We will end up in a more sustainable place than where we're headed today. Now, you all know, because of the Rio conference 20 years ago, what global warming is, right? You all know that we're in a global competition to create green tech and green jobs. And what I want to say to you is, if Rio 1992 put that into our consciousness, I hope Rio 2012 can put global aging into our consciousness, and that we start a competition to say who's going to develop the gray technologies and the gray jobs for our swiftly aging planet. So carry that thought with you into the workshops today. Think about it, and what I would say to you is, no more empty lots waiting for the magic of a hospital to be built. Use the connectivity technologies that are increasingly available and affordable and are right in front of us to do care very differently. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eric. And I think I'll follow. Anne had her algorithm that had 3 elements to it: food, water, and energy. Eric had his 3 C's. I think we have time for 3 questions, and then we'll move on. Let's see. I think one right here. Anything coming in from Twitter? Real good.
Thank you. My name's Erica Wyrick. I've been working with Dr. Miley and the engineering students on a course called Engineering for Good. And 2 years ago, the students addressed a problem in Fresno, which is the second most polluted city in the nation, where most children in Fresno were not accessing care, even though there was ostensibly a safety net clinic system. Most children, if they were getting care for their asthma, they were getting it in the school. And the rate of asthma was close to over 40%, where it's 15% nationally. And so the students were trying to address this with using mobile technology to allow asthma educators to bring care to the sites where children were being seen, the emergency room in the schools, and they did a fantastic job, made an amazing mobile interface. But I'm surprised to hear about all of the different things that have been developed elsewhere, and wondering, what do you think the barriers to what do you think the silos are due to, where some of the things that have been developed that sound like they might work in these contexts that we even have here, where there aren't enough providers in areas like Fresno? Why? What are the barriers to getting those communicated, and what solutions do you see to breaking down those silos and getting those working solutions communicated?
I think one of the biggest barriers to sort of shifting the healthcare paradigm, at both ends of the spectrum, the demographic spectrum, how do we drive better sort of prenatal and early life care and instill in younger people a sense of proactive health and prevention so that they don't develop the chronic diseases that the current 2 billion 60-year-olds and above are going to have, right? There's no way to avoid that end, and so we got to work both ends at the same time. And I think one of the things that's kept us from working on both ends is the way that we finance healthcare in most parts of the world, not just in the US. The fundamental importance of the healthcare reform bill in the United States and its change, and by the way, there's 22 other countries that have passed health reform as well, is the beginning, and it was in the earlier talk today, it's the beginning of the shift to a payment model that says, pay for good results, don't pay for just the number of procedures, right? Even with the technology that we've been working on, people started to sort of say, well, we'll pay for the number of virtual visits or video conference visits as opposed to just face-to-face visits. And I'm like, no, that's the wrong mindset, right? What you want to do is develop a care paradigm for young people and old people that says there's care flexibility. I'm going to use technology when it's appropriate. I'm going to use the phone when it's appropriate. I'm going to do a face-to-face visit in the home when it's appropriate. And I'm going to do care in a traditional clinic or hospital when it's appropriate. Use the right tool for the job. We could never use the right tool for the job when the entire economics of healthcare only rewarded sending you to the hospital or the clinic for everyone to get paid. So we're beginning through accountable care organizations in the US, through work that's going on in Australia, China, the UK, we're beginning to experiment with new models of payment that will create the incentive structures that allow this kind of an innovation to occur.
Anyone in the balcony by chance? Okay, last one. Anyone down here on? Thank you.
Hi, myself Gaurav. I just wanted to ask, like, considering the interdisciplinary nature of the problem at hand, especially in healthcare, so there's a dire need of like extreme collaboration between the technology that Intel has with the doctors and even how to deal with the issues, including health insurance and public policy. So have you given it, what are you doing in that particular aspect?
I lost the tail end of your question, so.
So I was just thinking, it's more appropriate to get solutions to the healthcare when we particularly have doctors and engineers really mingle together and get solution to the problems. So to that end, like what are you planning to do in Intel regarding your own plan?
Are you saying we need to sort of aim solutions at more than just doctors and to other people? I mean, I think that's part of our challenge is like, historically, we've kind of thought about fixing our healthcare system by just putting technology in the hands of the medical experts who use it. And I think the magic of a lot of these technologies, particularly smartphone-based and the sort of cloud-based applications is, and all the sort of behavior change possibilities that are existent with crowdsourcing and sort of personalized coaching that you can get on technologies around you. We need to focus the energy not just on the kind of technologize the experts, but technologize everybody in the chain and figure out how to help them do a lot more care for themselves. I think that will be some of the most game-changing things that we can actually do.
Thank you, Eric. I think just given the time, and we're running right up before lunch, so I appreciate everyone's patience, and we'll move right on to Carmel. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As noted earlier, I am not Jack Dangermond. I am one of his employees. I've worked at ESRI for about 16 years, focused solely on how to apply geographic information systems, or GIS, to various issues of sustainable development. And my background's in geography and forestry, so I'm excited that his topic today happened to be environment. That's very helpful for me. About 12 hours ago, I became a very big advocate for health surveillance systems as a lead on when I discovered that he is ill with the flu. And so I decided that's really useful to know 12 hours prior to having to give this talk. So it was very critical for me. As many of you know from going to various types of sustainable development events, the world is changing rapidly, and it's creating many challenges for us to have to work on. Our organizations and the world at large have a lot of challenges we need to face, and we need a lot of collective intelligence and understanding to come up with solutions to these challenges. Today, I really want to focus on the solutions, not the problems. I want to have you thinking about how connective technologies such as geospatial systems are helping us understand. We talk a lot about data. We talk a lot about information. We can take data and turn it into information by doing things such as mapping it. Through the use of geographic information systems, or GIS, you can take those different individual maps and integrate them together to create knowledge, a better understanding of what is going on in a given place, the three pillars that Anne mentioned earlier, traditionally of social, economic, and environmental data, pulling them together and understanding. But it's not really until we share and collaborate, share that knowledge, and collaborate together that we really will have more full understanding. We need to communicate about what's going on. There already are many successful systems. Hundreds of thousands of organizations use our technologies to help better understand global climate change, to look at business efficiency, things like managing your fleet better to cut down carbon emissions, looking at things like land information management, et cetera. And we're helping them to make better decisions. I want to share a few of those with you here. Looking at monitoring environmental change. Organizations at all scales, from very local level all the way up to global level, are using geographic information systems as a way to understand various aspects of environmental change, like deforestation and coastal erosion. We're also using these technologies to manage our natural resources, once again at many scales, from local maritime protection in Abu Dhabi to looking at carbon accounting in Indonesia. And we're using these technologies to plan our future. You notice the title of the slide was Environment, Creating Our Future. We have the opportunity to design better urban infrastructures, have healthier urban environments, and ones that are appropriate to the populations that will be living in them, such as the older generations. We have an opportunity to look at solar potential and start thinking about renewable energies, et cetera. So we have this opportunity now to take these technologies together and have conversations and communicate about what's going on. And it doesn't have to be a conversation government to government. As the reason we're all here is we want to think about engaging citizens, thinking about things such as crowdsourcing. Bring Ushahidi's content and capabilities in and map it, understand flood reporting, where things are going. As an example. So our organization, ESRI, has been supporting conservation ever since it began. We work with individuals, we work with organizations, and we give our technology free to any NGO in the world to make sure that we can actually truly put our money where our mouth is and support environmental management and conservation planning. The other strong mission we have is about educating the next generation. We need to make sure that these students are able to think environmentally, think about their environment and understand what's going on around them. And one of the programs that we have been supporting since it started 10 years ago, before WSSD, is called My Community, Our Earth, MICO. And I hope that all of you will take a look and send students there and help them to understand how to build sustainable development projects in their own community and share them with each other. Yet, our independent efforts that have gone forward so far are really not enough. We need to pull all this information and the models and the applications and all together into a better global environmental information system and make it available to all. Our GIS technology is also changing rapidly, and so hopefully we'll have a convergence of the needs and the new capabilities of everyone really is a sensor these days with your cell phone and so forth. Being able to have real-time information coming in, bring that together with the capabilities of cloud computing, and look at new policies for information access, open data and all, bring it all together, and all of that, GIS is taking advantage of all those other technological advances and helping us really look at a multi-dimensional approach to managing our world. And as a result, a new pattern is emerging. We're seeing that cloud GIS is what we're seeing really making a huge impact in being able to convey environmental knowledge out to the rest of the world. It no longer has to sit with environmental professionals in a lab or at a research site. It can now, that information can be brought together, integrated, and shared with knowledge workers, with managers, policymakers, and citizens. And many organizations are applying this new platform, this new capability of cloud GIS, within the US government, such as the geospatial platform of the US government, with the European Environment Agency launching the Eye on Earth network, with UNEP Live, which will be launched at the Governing Council in 3 weeks. So NGOs are also doing this. And this pattern will then provide some of that common infrastructure we need for this global environmental information system. We'll be able to integrate and synthesize information together, facilitate the communications that need to occur, and break down some of the barriers between institutions and different cultures and disciplines. This new common language will allow us to better coordinate the work that we are doing so we don't find out that the two hospitals are being built next to each other, or as someone had talked about earlier today. So as a result, we'll have a method for measuring, managing, analyzing the information, visualizing so you can do better design and planning and make better decisions and take action. This will be an important environmental nervous system for our planet. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and just note that this is nothing new. Design with Nature was a book written by Ian McHarg. I highly recommend it. He was a regional planner as well as a landscape architect. I see a few people nodding their heads. They know this one. He came up with this idea 50-some years ago and didn't have the technology that we have today to actually implement it. He had to take acetate layers and understand what's going on, layer them one on top of the other. We can now do that and take geographic knowledge and integrate it together to have a better design process. And as a result, come up with plans, scenarios. We call this Geo Design, designing our world and doing it with the information and knowledge that we need. And it's going to be a systematic process. So there's kind of a workflow here, looking at data inventories, measuring what's going on in the environment, then modeling it with process models, looking at various suitability models, designing and sketching various scenarios and determining what's the best way, which direction do we want to go, and evaluating those analyses, and finally applying some values and judgments to make decisions. Geodesign, like GIS, will be an evolutionary step. It'll be applied to a lot of different fields, transportation planning, agriculture, et cetera, by everyone from individuals all the way up to society. It's happening now, creating our future. The graphic on the left there is Gombe Park in Tanzania, and Jane Goodall Institute works with the local communities to look at conservation plans and different options. Lastly, I just wanted to point out that in order to convey a lot of this complex environmental information to the average citizen, or to my grandmother, we need to have Geo Information Products that are very understandable. And there's some good points about how to do this. So we need to not only understand the issue ourselves as scientists and all, but we need to then have the appropriate data available, analyze and manipulate it, but then design the output, design that information product, and have a very compelling design so someone can look at it and understand immediately what it is. So this actually was in Tim Riley's presentation this morning. At the very bottom of the wiki page, it was one of the last inputs to the wiki page about the tsunami. This is very timely information if you're in Hawaii, correct? Look about, that bright red area, understanding where the tsunami is going to be impacting various parts of our world. Good products also disseminate knowledge. Unfortunately, after the nuclear disaster following the tsunami, they've evacuated 4 kilometers to prevent radiation exposure. Well, clearly that wasn't far enough. If we had this prior to the 2 weeks after the disaster, it might have made a big difference in terms of people's radiation exposure. And good products are going to communicate importance. Red is very powerful. This is where we need to implement what we're doing. These are the sites suitable for conservation. And we also need to support decision-making. We recognize that government officials have so much information coming into them these days, but we need to really synthesize it down to say that these are the top 3 choices you should make, or this is the most suitable place in South Korea for a wind turbine. Or on the right side, these are the most suitable places to actually be drilling for oil. And lastly, I just wanted to point out the good products illustrate change. On the left, you have Landsat imagery being provided to look at change in urbanization over time, and on the right, looking at temperature changes around the globe. So in summary, we need to think about how to design these information products to make them most meaningful and share this environmental information so it can make good decisions can be made, and we will have an effective story to tell. And while technology is helping, I just want to make sure nobody in the room forgets that we need strong vision and leadership, strong stewardship of data, long-term data sets. We need open sharing policies to promote all of this. And we need sort of a global plan for these next items of standards and data models and all. And we need people on the ground actually working and implementing these types of systems. And most of all, we need good people. I think we have a lot of good people here, so that's exciting. And this spirit of collaboration, I hope, will take us from beyond the Stanford campus to Rio and help us all make our world a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmel.
You want to sit in here?
And if there's one question, and then we can move on just so we can keep as close to schedule as possible. I think the gentleman in the back.
Thank you. My name is Bright Simons, and I'm founder of an organization called Empedgree Network, which is a system that allows consumers to check if their medicines are genuine and not counterfeit. In actual fact, we do work with HP, among our other partners. I find, of course, the presentation compelling, and I think Geo tagging and Geo products, etc., are going to be important. My only concern is there is an assumption that all the key stakeholders in a process such as this appreciate that transparency and accountability is important. But that is a very, very profound assumption to make. And in my own experience, more often than not, there is a tendency to want to hide information for, basic and obvious political economy reasons. So the question is, how do we get those with power, the powers that be, to be completely committed to the kind of transparency and accountability frameworks that are going to make such Geo-driven systems actually effective?
Very good question. I mean, I'm seeing a kind of almost a wave now across the world in many countries like Moldova, Kenya, et cetera, of this open data initiatives. They're looking at ways to share data. Obviously, the US government's led this for many years with FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. But I'm just seeing an amazing wave now of other countries starting to share their data and being more transparent and accountable. I think in Moldova, they originally shared a whole bunch of data sets and realized some of these aren't really that useful. So they kind of made better ones and shared those as a result of that open data policy. I mean, there's crowdsourcing and so forth, that type of data, and the ability to map that as citizens and get that information out there that's important. But I think it's also important that the citizens keep working with their governments and making sure that they're electing people that are excited about open data and transparency so that we can have better information about where aid flows are going, better information about what's happening for environmental planning. There's, I think, a really good example is World Resources Institute has a forest atlas for DR Congo. And you can see in there where the forest concessions, where the protected areas, where the actual logging's going on. Sometimes that logging's in a protected area, but until you really know that out in the field in a remote area, and that data was collected by NGOs, I can't say that the government exactly knew that this logging road had gone off into a protected area. It takes a lot of resources to have monitoring and evaluation of that way out in remote areas. So I think when everyone's working together in that type of way, you end up with a whole nother level of transparency. So those types of initiatives where public-private partnerships and organizations working from the NGO ground level to the, working in hand with the governments to improve information and make it available is really critical.
Thank you, Carmel. And last but not least, I think we'll transition to Paul, coming to us from the Kauffman Foundation.
Thanks. Apparently, I was about to blow it up. Cool, thanks. What's that? Forward. Oh, okay, thanks. Hi, I'm Paul Kudrowski with the Kauffman Foundation. So I'll be 60 seconds, roughly. No, it might be slightly longer. So the Kauffman Foundation, for those of you who don't know, and even for those of you who do, because it's the same either way, is a foundation out of Kansas City, $2 billion foundation devoted to entrepreneurship and economic growth. So we're sort of obsessed about the subject of entrepreneurship, and we're particularly obsessed with the subject of entrepreneurship in service of economic growth, not just in the United States, but around the world. And so in talking about entrepreneurship, in particular in this context, we like to talk about it as a free lunch in economic terms. It's one of those things that doesn't exist or shouldn't exist, but it does. It's a way of getting prodigious benefits as a society in ways that doesn't feel, like fair. It doesn't feel like this should be able to happen. And one of the ways I try to characterize it is talking about a sort of a famous statistical model called the drunkard's walk, which many of you may be familiar with. And this is this great idea that when a drunk walks out of a bar, and he's only got one place to go, right? I mean, he can only sort of go forwards or backwards, right? We don't allow them to go left or right. So just walk out of the bar, left, forwards or backwards. The door closes behind them, right? So the door closes behind you as you come out of the bar. Given enough time, with 100% probability, if you can only take one step forward or one step backward at each moment, where are you going to end up? You're going to end up in the gutter, right? I mean, because you can't go left, right? It's bounded. It's what's called a bounded distribution. I can't go left. There's a wall and a closed door in the way. I can only go right. It's kind of magic, right? I mean, leaving aside the drunk part. It's sort of a magic property of this distribution that's bounded on the left side. Entrepreneurship, in many ways, plays a very similar function in the economy because it's also a bounded distribution. We act like it's magic, in particular here in the United States, and say things like, the primary net source of job creation in the United States is young companies. Like when we repeat this kind of litany, like it's somehow magical, but it can be no other way, right? I mean, this is the magic of entrepreneurship because think about it. When I create a company, how many people do I get to fire? None. Right? I'm in a bounded distribution. There's nothing to do other than I can hire people, I can stay the same size, but I don't get to start off and immediately go negative, right? It might be interesting to imagine how that would work. Large companies have that, we'll call it luxury, right? They can fluctuate up and down. So the magic of an entrepreneurship, as much as it seems like this incredible idea that the primary source of net job creation and one of the primary sources of economic growth is this magic business of entrepreneurship, it's not magic at all, right? It's driven by the distribution. It's the nature of the beast. It can be no other way. And so once you realize that, there's your free lunch, right? There's your free lunch. We want more of these people. We want more of these people because they can't help but do good for us, right? They can't help but do good in exactly the way I'm describing. So I want to sort of tie this into this, our view of the economy of Kauffman. So our view of the economy of Kauffman is this kind of synthesis view, right? Where startups are informed by what happens at large-scale firms, mostly because we're trying to torpedo them, right? One of the best ways to grow a new business is to mess up a large existing one. So we love startups because they play that anarchic sort of Schumpeterian role in the economy, and they're also in turn informed by innovations at universities, and government sort of plays this level playing field role. But that's sort of our view of how all of these pieces come together. But as you sort of think about what's gone wrong or what's gone on over the last few years, there's been this incredible exodus of some of the most entrepreneurial talent in the economy, scientists, physicists, engineers, and others. Where? To the most dysfunctional place in the economy possible, and which is Wall Street. Wall Street, right? I call this great sucking sound on Wall Street. I just sucked everybody into sort of, all of a sudden we're all going to be, we're going to be bond traders, or we're going to design synthetic instruments of mass financial destruction, whatever, your favorite, whatever your favorite stuff is that these guys create. But what's happened over the last few years, not just in the US, but around the world, all of a sudden this process kind of hit a lock point, right? Where suddenly we couldn't absorb more credit. We're seeing it happen in the Eurozone. We're seeing it happen in most developed economies. So what happens to these people who were getting sucked into all of these other places? Suddenly they're going back to the higher and better use in the economy, which is working for science, technology, and engineering companies, creating their own companies. We get that free lunch back again, right? Because one of the great puzzles over the last few years is why more of these people weren't doing that sort of thing. And the answer in part is they were getting sucked into Wall Street and disappearing into that particular vortex. And the way that connectivity plays back into it is it's yet another free lunch, right? Because think about what's happened in the world of science and engineering over the last 20 years, but certainly accelerated in the last 4 or 5. This is a visualization that I just saw in the last few days, actually, but it was a map of scientific collaborations from 2005 to 2009 as measured by co-authors in different locations. What would this have looked like 20 years ago? What would it have looked like 50 years ago? What would it have looked like 100 years ago? It's not just a novelty that we like having people in different locations collaborating, right? What do we know about innovation? Innovation is driven by a whole bunch of things, but primary among them, and Stephen Johnson's written about this, lots of others have, it's driven by collisions, right? It's driven by people colliding. Matt Ridley likes to say it happens when ideas have sex. That works for me. So think about it in any of those ways. And so what we're trying to promote in the context of driving innovation, in particular entrepreneurial innovation, is more collisions. So as you think about it in your own countries, your own regions, what are we doing things to promote more innovation, and are we letting connectivity drive those collisions, right? So think about it in those terms. One of the ways that this is ideas having sex, by the way. One of the ways we like to think about it in terms of is in terms of Dunbar's number, right? So Dunbar's number says how many people we can sort of maintain relationships, right? We maintain relationships with. It's sort of an interesting sociological phenomenon. And the argument is it's something like 125 or so, and that's been borne out by even numbers in terms of the kind of relationships people have over Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere. So that's kind of cool, but what's interesting is if you think about it in terms of developing countries and countries outside sort of the US and Western Europe, there is another opportunity here, right? For more, do people have the same level of sort of ambient intimacy, as we call it, with all sorts of other people via some of these social media? Is there an opportunity to drive more collisions and connectivity and thereby let more ideas have sex? And absolutely, there's no question. And we're seeing it happen even right here in the Bay Area. Look at what collisions are doing to Facebook. This is a map of talent flows in the Bay Area. Where's the great sucking sound in the Bay Area? Facebook, right? Everything flows into Facebook. These are talent ratios, right? For every one person who goes to, Microsoft, 30 and a half, I don't know who that is, half. 30 and a half go to Facebook. So you're seeing this sort of collision and this flows and this flux happening here in the Bay Area. And where's everybody coming from? There's sort of a great source of talent here in the Bay Area, sadly. Yahoo, right? It's sort of like Yahoo is the happy hunting ground for everybody. It's like, to a first approximation, last Yahoo person shut out the lights or something, but everybody's leaving. So, but you can think about it in you can think about it in geographic terms too, right? We're modeling this a lot at Kaufman and looking at it at the country level. I was just talking about this in Spain recently. This is a map of flux at the country level, thinking of sort of people as connectors and people as data sensors, as one of the other speakers said. So this is, what do we see in Detroit, Michigan? This incredible outbound, this exodus, right? This unprecedented exodus of people from a single geographic region, which has been persisting now for the better part of 5 or 6 years. So it's, on some level, that's not totally surprising, and it speaks to both the economic lack of opportunity in Detroit as well as US mobility. Let's take it to another part of the country. Here's Randolph County, Elkins, West Virginia. What do we see there? Someone moves, where are they going? Next door. They're not going anywhere, right? So we can dive into this a lot deeper, but just at a superficial level, if you think about collisions and flux being drivers of innovation and drivers of economic growth, are we likely to see more of that in a place like this? And let's even bring in Detroit, or more of it in Detroit. We're likely to see more in Detroit because for no other reason, there's change, right? There's at least flux. There's at least something going on. West Virginia is kind of this phenomenon of almost like sort of people circling each other in counties. Now let's bring in new regions. It's too easy to do the Bay Area, so let's do Boulder. Right? Because Boulder sort of emerged as a hotbed region. Maybe it's a model for other countries to think about and other regions to think about. There's this really interesting phenomenon, right, where we're seeing this incredible inbound and outbound migration of people in and out of the city. Interestingly enough, and this is true in the Bay Area as well, outbound migration actually over the period dominates inbound migration. Too often when I talk to people outside, well, certainly around the United States, but all around the world, they're so obsessed with keeping everyone we have, right? I want to grow and I want to build sustainable economic growth. So we've got to keep everyone we have. It's a completely topsy-turvy way to think about it, right? You want to think in biological terms about changing the organism. It's all about bringing people in and having people go, but you don't want to think about just maintaining the people you have because then nothing changes. So it's really all about the sort of the inbound and outbound flow, which is the way I would encourage you to think about it in your own country. So the way this plays back into sort of sustainable economic growth is that connectivity, flux, these collisions, is this free lunch, right? Not only is it a free lunch in terms of driving more innovation and driving more sort of ideation and letting ideas have sex, but it also shifts the cost curve, right? It shifts the cost curve of creating things, of being more productive and driving new inventions, not just because connectivity itself shifts the cost curve, but also because the notion of sustainable development is driven around things like repurposing and recycling and reusing and renewing. We're not trying to sort of tear down and find ways of sort of asset stripping the stuff that's out there. We're taking what's out there and reusing it as economically as possible. And in shifting the cost curve, we drive the kind of invention and we drive the kind of innovation that we want. And this is a model, I think, for all of us to think about as we think about the way that connectivity represents an entrepreneurial free lunch in driving sustainable economic growth worldwide. And I'll stop, because I know you guys want to go to lunch. I'm happy to take questions, and that was very speedy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. We have time for a couple questions, and then we'll break for lunch. Great. Well, it doesn't look like there are questions. I know Paul will be here. I think as everyone, thank you for your patience as we've been a little over. I think I'd like to task everyone as you sit down to lunch, and we've been talking about connective technologies. I think the thing you'll be able to do at lunch is connect with one another, and I think discuss the opportunities of where technology plays a role. But I think as we all get ramped up, and it's not too far along before we'll all see faces again in Rio, to really have discussions about what we just talked about now, as well as a few of the sessions this morning, and then to help you prep for the breakouts this afternoon. Thank you. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for their time.